Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jennie Johnson,
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
and today we have two guests joining us. They co wrote a book together, which we're very interested in learning more about, especially since we just had Amy Shea on a couple weeks ago and her book, Too Poor to Die. So this is sort of kind of a additional follow up to what we talked about with Amy. And their book is called Equity at the End: The New American Way of Death. And so we would like to welcome to the show today Staci. Staci, I totally forgot to ask you this before we hit record, but is it Savattaro?
It's exactly right. Thanks.
Oh,
Perfect.
very good.
Staci Savattaro and Jennifer Wright-Berryman. So welcome, ladies, to the
Yeah,
show.
welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I totally meant to ask you that before I hit the record button. And then I looked at your name again and I was like, oh, I'm hoping I say this right.
You
It's
did.
perfect. It's perfect.
So, this is actually a very important book that you guys wrote because the death care industry has undergone, I think, a lot of changes in the past couple of decades, actually. And we've learned, I mean, Diane and I have learned more and more through the guests that we've had on the show. And Diane herself, working in a cemetery now, I think has picked up a lot of information that we didn't know. And so, one of the things that I'm really liking about what I was reading about what you guys were writing about is how the industry has changed and how it affects multiple different types of populations across the US. But also, really, it sounds like the importance of pre-planning and making your wishes known before it's too late, because that's for so many families, especially if it's never been talked about, it puts them in this really weird position of trying to figure out what to do with their loved ones after they've gone, if they've never had the discussion. So, what led the two of you to even come together and make this particular book and talk about all these really hard subjects that need talking about, and then writing it all down for us?
I'll start with how it came to be, and then Jennifer, you can say like how we made it into real life and why that everything is so important. So we start our book by saying that we met how normal people meet, which was in a funeral home. Isn't that how
That's how we all meet,
everyone
right?
becomes friends, right? I mean, that's what we did. So Jennifer and I are both professors in totally different disciplines, and we both happen to be attending an event. I'm here in Central Florida in Orlando. Jennifer was in town. We have a mutual friend who was hosting an event, and we just started talking, hit it off immediately, and said, let's just keep in touch, as people do. And we did. And I said to her one day, I said, let's write a book. And I don't know, Jennifer, maybe you thought I was kidding. And then all of a sudden there was like an outline in your inbox. And I didn't have to twist Jennifer's arm too hard. And we came together to write a book from two totally different disciplinary backgrounds, but speak to, as Jenny, you were saying, something really important that touches on. I come from a public sector perspective. Jennifer comes from, a sociological perspective and a social work perspective and studies an industry perspective. So had all these really cool, different lenses of looking at this question. So we just met in a funeral home, had an idea, and Jennifer can tell you where we took it from there.
I love this.
Doesn't
What
sound
what's
familiar at all.
I know it's very similar to our origin story. So,
what Stacy hasn't told you is that there was a little stalking involved. So I was doing a three-part research study on the funeral industry, and when I was looking for literature for other research in this field because it's really, really an under-researched area,
mhm.
is both, really the spectrum of death care, all the way from that pre-planning, pre-arrangement, all the way through. There's a lot of research on grief and bereavement. But all the way through memorial and body disposition, there's really almost nothing. Especially in the United States, you see quite a bit of research coming out of the UK. But so I found Stacy's work as I was looking for more research, and at the same time as these serendipitous things tend to happen, I got connected with a woman in Stacy's area who is doing a lot of advocacy. She works for Dignity Memorial as a planning specialist, pre-arrangement specialist. Um, and so I was in touch with her, and she was leading this small sort of conference type thing. And I said, "Have you heard of Staci Savattaro?" And she's like, "No, but it sounds like I need to." And I said, so I connected the two of them. And then I flew down to Orlando, and then that's when we all met for the first time, even though we had been in touch. So there was a little bit of stalking. I cold emailed Stacy, and I'm like, "Listen," I'm like, "Girl, there's only a few of us in the country doing this work. We really need to meet." And I felt so grateful that Stacy is the marvelous, wonderful human being that she is, that she was open to collaborating and yeah. So and then I started I started kind of a program, and Stacy sat on, that sort of development committee, and we would meet and just really brainstorm from all of our different perspectives about how to make death care more equitable, both as researchers, but also as sort of community practitioners and advocates and boots on the ground. And so you know, that's another part of our story is the stalking part.
I love it.
It made me so happy.
So you don't often hear somebody being like, "I'm glad you were stalking me." So
That's right.
Yeah,
usually it's the
great.
other way around.
Yeah.
So I find this fascinating because, and we've talked about this many, many times on our podcast, especially in America, for the longest time, talking about death has been a big taboo.
Mhm.
So you didn't really talk about it even in your family, and definitely not out in the greater community, right? Funerals would happen and people would go to the funerals and maybe a graveside burial or whatever. But beyond that, we weren't considering all the aspects that go along with it, even the stuff leading up to death. So hospice care and end of life care and things like that. Like that all forms part of probably what you're researching here. And now I think, and especially with social media, I think there is more open dialogue about it. But like you said, there's still not a lot of research on it and how it all affects us as communities, as individuals, as families. So I think this is so fascinating that you chose to pick this particular subject to study and put together, and hopefully bring a little bit more awareness to how this all works for people. So what would you guys like to start with, like the important part of the topic here?
Oh gosh.
I'll just start. This is a pivot for me. So I'm what's called a suicidologist. So I study suicide prevention and the phenomenon around, when someone takes their life or attempts to take their life. And I was at a suicidology conference years ago, and we were kind of having a conversation at the conference, a bunch of us, around the lack of death education. As someone who tries to prevent unnecessary death, not knowing enough about how that unique and sometimes stigmatized death and memorial happens. And I was getting calls as an expert in suicide and suicide prevention from funeral directors and pastors and folks saying, "How do we, memorialize someone, properly or appropriately?" And I realized that I needed to know more about funeral care, death care. So I started on my own personal journey to learn more. And then I got a grant. I developed this idea to do a grant or to apply for a grant. And so I got grant funding. And so that's kind of how I started doing this research about 5 years ago. So that's kind of how I got into it.
And it's also a pivot for me. I'm a professor of public management, and a lot of my early work is in public sector marketing and branding. This is a total 180. It's been almost almost a decade for me studying this particular question. I've always been someone who's loved old cemeteries, though. Couldn't tell you why, couldn't tell you how. I'm always going to end up in one. The running joke is if I travel and don't end up in a cemetery, something has gone awry with my trip if I
Love
don't end
it.
up there. So, almost a decade ago now in Orlando was the Pulse nightclub shooting, which at the time was the worst mass fatality shooting incident in the country. Myself, a colleague, and two of our PhD students at the time did some research with the city of Orlando and about we interviewed about 40 public servants from the city, county. Um, Two of the interviews we did stood out to me, one with the city cemetery manager and one with the county's medical examiner. And just learning what they had to go through um, to respond. And as somebody who's always loved cemeteries, I thought, gosh, what more could I learn as a professor of public management when we think of this aspect of public service? So I just kind of like Jennifer said, on her journey, I just went to our public management literature in our journals and said, gosh, we really don't talk, Jenny, to the point you made about death in our literature head on this way. So I like to say I study local government public servants, asking questions, how and why do you do what you do? So I've talked to almost 70 folks throughout the country who manage, municipal cemeteries, medical examiners, coroners, some folks at the federal level. It's a real complex bureaucracy of death that we have in this country. And, Jennifer can tell you the more threads we pull on,
Mm,
some research questions, and you're like, I got it. It all unravels into 20 more threads where you try to
uh,
learn something. So the equity issues manifested in my research a little bit differently than they did in Jennifer's, but came together so nicely in, the book that we, wrote together. And what we tried to do was pull out some of the equity issues that are bigger, but also maybe, I don't know, I liked the ones that I thought were a little bit like hidden that you didn't think about. So that's how I got to it. And I still, when I talk to people in my discipline about, oh, I study death, they're like, this is a public management thing. And I say, well, we have to, what's the land use question when we're running out of space for cemeteries? Who's
right.
responding to mass fatality incidents? COVID-19 saw a relaxation, for example, of environmental quality. So you could run crematory. These are all government questions. So I'm still convincing folks even a decade later, but they're slowly coming around. And I think the nicest compliment I got the other day, someone said to me, every time I read a story about cemeteries, I think of you. And I was like, oh, thank you so much.
I love when somebody says that to me. So,
Yeah, it's like the best compliment. I was like, thank
yep.
you.
No, that's the best compliment. You're right.
I'll take it.
So, speaking of, you found you're finding all these little threads and all these things that we're not thinking about necessarily, definitely probably on the basic public level. Again, it's a topic people want to avoid. And the fact that you're kind of starting with the mass fatalities. And of course, here in Colorado, we just had another school shooting a couple of weeks ago. I'm fortunately only one fortunately unfortunately one life was lost in that particular incident. It could have been worse though. And I don't think we hear about those things and we're shocked and we're angry and but and then everybody is talking about gun control and things like that, but I don't think anybody's putting into thought, other than the families of the victims, what happens with those victims. Obviously they have to go to the coroner and they have to do the autopsies, and then they have to arrange for burial or cremation or whatever they're choosing to do. And unless you're that immediate family, you're probably not thinking beyond that and what's happening. So in all your research and you're finding these little threads, what are some of the most surprising threads that you have found for dealing with all of this?
Oh gosh. Well, my specific area of expertise is within the funeral industry is sexual and gender minority equity and equitable death care. So for me, I study how the LGBTQIA community is able to um, have the kind of death care that aligns with their life story. So all the way back when I first started doing this research, I noticed that, LGBTQ voices weren't really in the conversation, which is interesting because funeral service is one of the um, professions or occupations where you see a lot of LGBTQ folks. And so I was very curious about that. So the first study I did back in, we'll see, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, was a content analysis of nationally randomly selected funeral home websites. So I looked to see if funeral home websites had inclusive language and graphics and some other iconography and forms. And so a lot of, you can, if you've been on a funeral home website, a lot of times you can click and there'll be forms and you can open up the form and start filling some things out, whether it's to kind of kick off your pre-planning or pre-arrangement or to find more information or to kind of let them know, and those forms were very, they weren't very inclusive. So then I started digging. I published that paper. I started digging further, and then I started doing, like Staci had talked about her interviews. I started doing interviews, and I interviewed dozens and dozens of people in doing all kinds of death care. So I interviewed medical professionals, hospice. I interviewed, people in the faith community. I interviewed funeral directors, funeral home owners, mortuary science students, mortuary science professors, just you name it. I interviewed people to kind of really capture at what intercept point, is do I see any equity where, what are the barriers and facilitators? What are the solutions to inequities? So that is, a lot of what's in the book that we wrote together. That's a lot of what I had to contribute. But along the way, I learned a heck of a lot more about the funeral industry than just its inequities. I think one of the most surprising, to circle back to your original question, one of the most surprising things to me, because everything can be surprising when you're coming from a place of scratch, right?
Right.
Um, is just the sea change in how mortuary science students now are approximately 60 to 70% women. And so we are seeing a change in both funeral directorship and funeral home owning. And we're seeing a lot more women in the industry. And so the average funeral home is about 65 years old, and they are typically family owned, right? So
Mhm.
they get passed down. Well, we're hitting a generation that doesn't want to follow in the family footsteps in terms of funeral home ownership. So then you've got either A, larger sort of funeral home conglomerates like Newcomer or whoever, kind of buying out funeral homes, or SCI coming in and buying them.
Yeah.
Um, or you've got brand new ownership, or you've got co-ownership, but it's not necessarily family ownership. And we're just seeing a lot more women, and we're seeing a lot more, we are seeing change. Historically, the funeral industry doesn't like change, it likes to stay the same. I just went to a funeral yesterday morning. I've been in that funeral parlor. I still use the word parlor, which I still makes me chuckle, but um, I I have been in there for that. In fact, that's where my father's funeral was at. In that very same room was where my father's viewing was. The wallpaper has not changed. The carpet color has not changed. Okay, we're
Mm.
still talking mauve. Mauve was never a good color, ever. Like not even back in the 80s when we
But
were
it's
all.
in a lot of funeral homes.
Wait, but so there's a thing with mauve. Maybe it's supposed to be a peaceful color, but so I would say the lots more women in the industry. So we're starting to see some philosophical changes as well when we're getting more women in the industry, and then also that change in sort of leadership because of families not necessarily wanting to be owners anymore.
Do we know why it's become more women versus men over the years? Like in your research, what I'm assuming you've asked, what made people interested in wanting to be in this particular industry?
Yeah. So it's really kind of there's a couple of different reasons, but funeral being a funeral director is a caretaking role.
Mhm.
It I think it appeals to our sensibilities as you know, women, aunts, mothers, grandmothers, caretakers, helpers, natural heart, heart to heart connectors. I mean,
Right.
I think, that is a specialty that we have. And so I think there's a draw to the work in that respect. But also, I think with other historically male dominated professions, um, once there was an increase in women interested in the profession, it kind of caught fire. So I think it appeals because there are funeral homes in your geographic location. There are training programs that are more accessible now, so you do not have to necessarily like drive
Mhm.
to a mortuary college anymore. You can do some online classes and programming and then do your hours, hours, training hours at a local place that's been certified for that. So I think it's really opened a lot of doors for more women but also again because there are some similar reasons why LGBTQ folks are drawn to it's an independent job, right? So
Mhm.
it's the teams are small generally, and so you have more privacy, and quite frankly when you're working with the dead they don't judge you, so
Yeah, they're not going to say a whole lot at that point.
they're not yeah.
Well, it also makes me wonder too, thinking historically, if we go back many, many decades, years, centuries, even, you know, when bodies were prepared in the home, before we had funeral homes, before we had an industry, mostly it was the women that did that particular work. They prepared the bodies, they dressed the bodies, they were the ones in charge of the wake and the food and all the things that went along with the death care before there was a death care industry. So it's kind of interesting to see it turning back to
Back around.
That's a
what it
great
was
point.
historically, like
That's a
just
great
circling
point.
back.
And then also if you look at death doulas, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you were to look at the ratio of women to men in a companion death doula in, that role is much more, woman driven.
And actually, I mean, I know Diane and I know what a death doula is. Will you explain to our listeners what a death doula is versus like a hospice care nurse or somebody
Yeah, a
in that
death
particular
doula
role?
is not necessarily a clinical role,
Right.
although some death doulas can be I mean, like you can be a nurse and also
Yep.
be a death doula. So it's a specialized training program. And NELDA is the kind of the national group, but they train to be sort of end of life, compassionate companions. There may be some spirituality involved. It really is catered to the person who's in the process of dying. So, where hospice is someone who's going to provide you medical care, comfort care. You may have a volunteer who also, through hospice, who may come and be present with you and, do some sort of end of life memorializing as well, and some remembrance and some things like that. Um, a death doula, I think, is someone who has more opportunity and training and specific skill sets around that being present and around that sort of while you're in that process, they know what's going on, they've trained and they understand both the physical, the cognitive, the spiritual aspects of dying. And so I think they have this really sort of beautiful ability to just hold with you as you're dying and be with you as you're dying and they're kind of they're kind of like shepherds, right? They're sort of like a
I like thinking of it that way.
yeah.
Yes.
And they help maneuver the families through the whole
Oh, thank you.
process
Yes.
Yeah.
that,
Yes.
until you have to go through it, people have no idea what's
Yeah.
all involved and not to mention the cost and everything else.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point, Diane. It's very holistic, and the family is very much part of the dynamic. Yeah.
which I think can be very helpful, especially for certain families. If you, again, if death has not been a topic that you've
Mhm.
wanted to discuss or you're comfortable around, having somebody who specializes in that to say, this is how it works, this is kind of how the body, works, this is all the things, and they can sit there, not just with the person who's dying, but also, yeah, those other people around them that may be struggling with the idea of letting go of their person.
You bring up a good point about not knowing or understanding, and you've mentioned a couple times that people don't like to think or talk about death. And one of the things, and Staci, if I could pass the baton to you, one of the things that we talk about in the book is death literacy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, I think when Jennifer and I set out to do this, we specifically wanted chapters, and we put them toward the end where we wanted to encourage readers, be they specialists in this, Jenny and Dianne, people who were already comfortable, people who maybe weren't comfortable, just to take something away to improve in some way, shape, or form their death literacy, even if it means now I can go into my own doctor and ask about this. I will pre-plan. So something that's surprising, not just my research, but to go back to your question, Jenny, people are surprised when they find out I have my death plans done. I'm 42. And so people say, that's so strange. But doing it for my father
Uh-huh.
and, watching that whole process, I thought, well, I'm just going to buy mine while we're here. And that's paid, that's done. I've chosen an option to, be a tree like many folks do. I don't know. I don't have the logistics of that worked out, but someone will plant my tree,
I
but
love
I
it.
have it all done. Thanks. Thanks.
I I volunteer
Perfect.
as tribute to
Great.
plant
So
Stacy's tree,
thanks. Somewhere sunny.
even though I'm 10 years older than you.
But it surprises people that I have this taken care of. It's done because I just don't. People are like, you're young, like, but you don't know, and I'd rather not have, if God forbid something happens, my mom have to think about that.
Mhm.
Anybody else. So we gave a bunch of resources, and Jennifer, maybe you can, point to, some of them and some of the work that you've done in that area. But we wanted people to be comfortable, and we ended our book specifically with a bunch of case, studies based on our particular research, things we heard from participants in our interviews, different scenarios to say, what if this happened? What could you do? And we wanted people to have, different questions to think about. And hey, do you know the laws in your state? Have you even looked up the laws in your
Hmm.
state? Do you know your rights as a consumer? What do you have access to? How could you get that data? Do you know how you can shop around for this? What does the quote unquote good death look like for you? Can you get access, to that? And I'll pass that back to you, Jennifer, because you've
Yeah,
done some
we
cool work
also
there.
we also talk a lot, and this is, building on Amy's work, or maybe just simultaneous with Amy's work. We do talk a lot about funeral poverty in the book.
A lot.
Um, and I don't know if you're familiar with Victoria Hanneman's work, or Tanya Marsh. These are legal scholars, and they both study this area from the legal perspective. And Victoria's done a ton of work in funeral poverty, and just how we're really, really missing opportunities to be able to almost save to die,
Mhm.
right? So, and it sounds so ironic or counterintuitive or something, to save money to die. I have to save money so I can die. But so we talk about that in the book, but we also talk about what happens, when you don't have the money. And then we also talk about, disparities with intersectionality. And it could be that doesn't necessarily always have to be race and gender and religion. It can be poverty, right? So disenfranchisement comes in many forms and oppression comes in many forms. And so we kind of talk about what if someone is this and has this going on and has this going on? What does their death care look like? Right. And so actually when Staci and I I
Uh-oh.
still laugh at this. So when our publisher sends over the first the first version of
Oh,
our cover of the cover
Uh-oh.
of the book, it had a dude, just one guy on the cover, like standing in front of a couple of like caskets, or was it casket? Were they
it
caskets?
was,
Yeah,
yeah, it
they
was
were
the
caskets
grave.
in like a
Hmm.
cemetery. And then one of them has a cross on it,
Across
and then the other one has like, I don't
the
remember.
American flag.
And we
Hmm.
were like the yeah,
We were like,
that's right.
no.
And we were like, no, no, that's not the message we're trying to send here. So we finally, we got to a point where we got a cover that we felt like is pretty much the theme of the book,
A
but
little more representative of
a little more
everything going on.
representative. Yeah,
Yes.
we just want a single dude just right there, yeah,
Well, and
but
the
yep,
poverty part of it, um, and we talked a lot about this with Amy a couple weeks ago. We have a large population in our country, unfortunately, who
Mhm.
are at or below the poverty line. They're struggling to live as it is, let alone what's going to happen once they've passed away. I know, in fact, my husband just signed for a very close friend of his who recently lost their last family member. Um, they needed them to sign a form so that they could donate the body for science.
yeah,
Now, whether that was the deceased wishes entirely, I'm not entirely sure. And I don't even think my husband knew all the details necessarily. He did it because this is what
Right.
needed to
The
be done.
best.
But it was a situation where financially they couldn't have afforded a funeral or a traditional burial. It just wasn't there for them. Um, and I mean, this just happened a few days ago. So this is like really in my head right now because we were having this discussion. And so, and we have our elderly population who are on these extremely fixed incomes. They use Medicaid for their health care, and there's the likelihood that once they've died, Medicaid will actually take any money they've had to pay themselves
right.
back. So now you don't, and there's a lot of people that don't know that. That's one of those really surprising things that in a lot of situations, Medicaid can take whatever assets there might have been back to reimburse themselves, which means now there's no money for a funeral or a burial or cremation or whatever it might be. And again, because we don't want to think about what's going to happen when we die, we don't always have that arrangement made.
Yeah, we don't save to die.
Yeah. And
Yeah, yeah.
Or people
And
just don't want to deal
death
with
benefit,
it.
yeah, death benefits are m- just so minuscule. I mean,
Mhm.
death, whether it's Social Security or,
even
and
life insurance policies don't always
oh,
cover everything.
yeah, I mean, and some people, yeah, some cultures we do, we have cultural context in our book and try to speak from different perspectives. I mean, despite that we are both white and both women, we want to make sure that, voices are represented, but and largely through our interviews and the diversity there, but in different cultures death is a major part of celebrating. I mean, the death care process and the memorial and just so not having the money
Mm-hmm.
is this celebration, in the African American community we have, homegoing, and we just there's parties and there's celebrations to be had, and there's processes and there's different things that need to happen, and those take money, right? And
Yeah.
what we touch on this in the book. We touch on the sort of the I don't even want to call it innovative. Maybe creative is a better word, but just the way that people crowdsource now
Mm-hmm.
money
Yeah.
to be able to pay for their death care. I know that when my husband's father died, it was during COVID. He didn't die from COVID, but he died during COVID, which I can be conflated. Sometimes
Right.
you die during COVID. Um, that he was career Air Force, right? But because of all of the bureaucratic, kind of messiness during COVID, they couldn't get it together. They just couldn't
Yeah.
get it together to get his military burial done.
Oh,
Mm.
So their family had to literally, like ask for donations to kind of help get him started, knowing that the military might reimburse the family later, hard to say. But, just people are going to, great lengths to try and give their loved ones the memorial and body disposition that they would want versus what is affordable, and so if I could touch on something else real quick, Jenny,
sure.
too. You mentioned that your husband signed papers maybe to help someone with donating a body to science. We also in the book, it's not a big section, but we do talk in terms of death care disparities and sort of the evils and ills that can happen. And you may have even seen it. NBC did a whole series on um, this sort of illegal donation of bodies from medical centers for research and other things. And so, that is something that is happening with more indigent folks who do not have
Mhm.
family
Right.
to step in and say, this is our loved one and we're claiming them, right?
Right.
So, the book, oh gosh, I got
Oh, I know which one you're
Pimmons,
looking for.
what's
Wait, I
that?
have it. I have it. I know which one you're looking
Yeah,
for.
yeah.
I have
So,
it.
so The Unclaimed. The book is The Unclaimed, which is Pamela Timon's. Yeah, yeah. So their whole book, if you haven't read that, it's absolutely excellent. But I think
Oh,
one is a medical anthropologist, maybe, and one's a sociologist. But it's that entire book is about the unclaimed in LA County, and
mm,
so we touch on that a little bit in the book because it is a form of, it's absolutely a disparity. It is a form of, it's inequity because when someone dies, it's as if when someone doesn't claim you that you are unclaimable, right? That you are it's this message that you don't belong anywhere. And that's not the message that humanity should be sending to its dead, or to people who will eventually die.
right.
That so when you talked about donating to science, it just occurred to me that we did talk about that some in the book, is there are stories about people who could have been claimed if there was just a tiny bit more legwork done. I know you talked a little bit with Amy about this, about some counties will hold on to, hold on to a deceased longer than others. Some it's
Yeah.
Hmm.
a couple weeks, some it's 30 days. So, but so we touch on that as well.
And
I
well,
think
and the other
that's
part of that was recording who these people were, right? Because
Yes, yes.
so often, especially if they were unhoused, didn't have family, whatever, they literally become a body that's been
Mhm.
cremated, and we don't know their name, we don't know anything about them anymore, and their
Right,
hmm
story as a human is completely gone. Like, how
right.
do
hmm
we, and so there was the importance of not only having some sort of disposal that creates some sort of dignity for these people, but also if somebody should want to go looking for them at some point, having something there that says, yes, this person was here,
hmm
they did live, this was their name, this is where they were at. We may not know much more than that, but at least it's something, and it gives them that little bit of dignity and humanity that
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
otherwise lose.
Their name is being recorded in the history of the community
Yeah.
because that they were a member of the community. Yeah.
And that's important because
Yeah.
otherwise we say it every episode, every life had a story.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and we don't always know the whole story anymore. And I know this from doing just historical research on a lot of the stories we've shared. I will run into roadblocks all the time trying to figure out, what somebody was doing. And it always, I feel kind of bad sometimes when, and we'll talk about it, is where I have to fill in gaps with maybes and possibilities, or we have to suppose maybe what they were thinking at one time or other when certain events happened, because part of the event is recorded. I found something in a newspaper article, I found some sort of record, but beyond that, we don't know what the person actually thought or felt about something.
Right.
We can only kind of assume that. And so we're filling in the blank in that weird way to do it. But at least we're remembering them somehow. But there's a lot of people that just we don't remember anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's where some of my research comes in, is to talk about the constraints that maybe those medical examiner offices are under, because oftentimes some of what y'all are just talking about and, is addressed in this book, in the episode with Amy, becomes unfunded mandates, right? Because there's no necessarily regulation. So, you have the state statutes, for example, that are so different across every state, and how counties then can implement those as well. If you have a county that's maybe really well funded, even LA is the example in this book, which is probably a little bit better funded than a county that has 100,000 people, and then you have there's all those trade-offs. That's what government is and does. And you have, like, Jennifer alluded to, 2 weeks versus 30 days. And then even then, I was just talking to somebody the other day, and he said, well, our state statute does say, the hospital should take a body for science. But sometimes the hospitals are like, no, I'm good. So,
They may not need it at that point.
And the county has, contracts for cremation, but that goes to the equity issues we were just talking about. So, I was just out of curiosity looking up, one of the contracts for a county in Florida, and it's a $500,000 contract over several years. That's $500,000 of, state funding or county funding. These are, again, things that fall to governments to do that we don't really consider. And so that's why I like to talk to the people in those roles and say, how? Why? So you have all of that then that trickles down. I mean, I talked to a coroner, kind of in 2021, COVID's still going on, and they said they actually had a lot of families after the state, you know, in the beginning, people were not claiming bodies. You couldn't, whatever the regulations were. Finally, the state put in a 10-day, you had to claim your loved one if they were deceased in a hospital somewhere. And people said, or the state said, we will cremate them for you. And some people said, huh, okay, go ahead and do that because I can't afford it. So you have those trade-offs of, is that good, bad? I'm not here to put a value judgment on it. It's just a response to a policy decision, right? So,
well, and so often, especially when it comes to the government decisions, whether that's your city government, state government, even the federal government, a lot of those, as far as the human portion of it, the workers, there's usually not enough of them. It's underfunded, and then a lot of times it is underfunded, especially this kind of, when governments are trying to figure out how to disperse all their money and all the everything, where do you put it all, and who should get this much and who should get this much. I'm sure when it comes to death specifically, that's probably way less funded than a lot of other programs, because they're not meaning to be maybe disrespectful to the dead in this case. They're just saying these people are dead and we still have to care for all these living people too. So where do you draw the line when you're making those policies and legislation and such?
I heard
I
a lot
also
of,
think, oh, I'm sorry, Staci.
I heard a lot of the refrain, paraphrasing, dead people don't pay taxes.
Yeah.
Mm.
I was gonna, that's, you're very close to what I was gonna say. The economics of death are really challenging because first of all, when we do sort of this actuary science, we're trying to figure out approximately how many people do we think, or, we're gonna lose, in terms of estimating. And, because, you know, we don't we don't have a crystal ball and we can't
Right.
predict how many people are going to die. We don't have, when governments are doing their budgets every year, they can't sit down and say, oh, we estimate. You can estimate, but it's challenging.
Right.
It's like any other type of health economics. It's just death economics, right? So I think it can be, and then, populations are very dynamic, but also, when you have something that happens like COVID that it just throws the whole game off,
Right.
know, and, then um, you've got people with long COVID, and you just have a new way of thinking about death when you've had such profound death. And I think it really, really shook up the funeral industry. It really shook up, the cemetery industry. And Stacy's much more of an expert and wrote quite a bit in the book about that impact. But when I look at, for example, and we also wrote about the business of death care. So sort of like being a funeral professional, being a cemetery professional, being in this sort of industry, and you know, the emotional tax, and then also the financial, being in this business and not really being able to really predict, when your business is that people need to die so you can stay in business,
Yeah.
it's so I think the
Yeah.
economics of it all are pretty tricky too, and we touch on that some in the book. But people don't want to think about it. And there are also, I don't know if you've talked about this on this podcast before, but there's a lot of scandal in the funeral industry as well.
No,
Unfortunately.
not at all in Colorado.
Oh,
None.
we've had several in the last couple of years here with it's it's horrible too because I think the majority of people in the death care industry, at least the ones we've interacted with, Diane and I, really do care. They really do care
Absolutely.
about what happens to the deceased, what happens with their families, what happens with, all of the things that go along with it. But then there are the ones who have figured out, oh, I can just rake in the money.
Right.
Who cares what happens to these bodies? Who cares, if we it was Eastern Cemetery in what state was it? My gosh, that episode was so long ago now, and I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm so sorry, Eastern Cemetery, because I know you guys listen. They had discovered that for decades, though, things had been mismanaged with the cemetery. So financially, things had been way mismanaged, but also they were discovering that bodies had been buried upon bodies. Like they just open up graves and throw bodies in that shouldn't have been where they were. And so it took a very long time before it all caught up to them. Now this particular cemetery is in a situation where it's no longer really owned by anybody, but nobody can really take over the ownership either because of the financial issues that it had. And it would cost an astronomical amount of money for somebody to actually take on full ownership of it. So now you've got a group of volunteers trying to maintain it, keep it clean, research who is there, and comfort these bereaved families who are discovering that their loved ones may not be where they thought they were, or maybe buried in another grave with somebody else. So it was a big scandal. And like I said, I had learned about that. I'd seen a documentary on it, and then I contacted them and I was like, can you come tell us more about what was going on in your cemetery? But it was one of those heartbreaking scandals where you're just like, the people that were committing the scandals had zero regard for the people that they would eventually hurt. They did not care how the outcome was going to affect these families. In even 20 and 30 years after the fact, you have a descendant that comes along looking for, a grandparent or a great grandparent or whatever, and it's gone. And yeah, and it was horrible. But yeah, we've had some issues here in the last couple of years too that just break my heart when I hear about them.
I think it was a
Well,
corner
when I
thing.
first started working at the cemetery like 10 years ago, it was one thing I never would not want to talk about this to my mom because, when you talk about death and funerals, and that's almost prophesizing it's going to happen, even though we all know it's going to happen. But watching families come in who had already had everything planned out, everything prepaid,
Hmm.
and just the lightness that I shouldn't say lightness. They'd already gone to the funeral home and all that expense. They come to the cemetery, and it was the one thing that was the easiest for them because all the decisions were already made. Everything was already paid. And that is, I think, one of the most important conversations a person can have with their family members because I already bought our spaces. We discussed if we want to be cremated, if we wanted to be buried. At one time, it was, the whole, Catholic whole casket stuff, but now that's different now. Next, the fact is the cost. My kids know exactly where we're going to be, so they know all that. So, when the time comes, and I hope it's 40, 50, 60 years from now, they won't be so blindsided with not knowing what to do. And I think for people that are afraid to talk about it, really need to start talking about it.
Yeah. We've seen some we've seen some progress. I know I've been a member of a death cafe for years, and there are groups out there having conversations. I think that funeral homes are doing a little bit more. Increasingly, I see them out tabling at festivals. Honestly, I was
Mhm.
just at a festival 2 weeks ago, and there was a table from one of our funeral families in town, and I think they are trying to be in the community. I agree with you, Jenny, that most funeral homes and funeral home owners and funeral directors have their community's best interest at heart, and they do
Mhm.
want to be, they don't want their, reputation to be stained by the bad actors in the
Right.
profession who are doing the sort of scammy upselling and kind of really taking advantage of people when they're making emotional decisions at the time
Mhm.
of loss and grief. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's this like really interesting emotional sort of delicate balance between sort of doing it all ahead of time and prearranging and kind of doing it so your kids don't have to do it and saving them, protecting them from that process. But then, kind of like what you're talking about, Diane, that process can also be part of, that journey of healing and catharsis. We have birth celebrations
Mhm.
and we plan birthdays, and we remember our loved ones on the anniversary that we lost them. And so, we're sad and we're grieving and we're horrified and we're stricken and we've got all these things going on. At the same time, we're trying to pick out a daggone casket or a headstone, or do I like that, that shape, that color, that stone, what do I
Right.
want? And those are really hard decisions to make when you're not sad, you know?
Right.
So I think that I think there's benefits and drawbacks to all of that. But
But it's just being educated with, and I hate
yeah,
when families have to make the choice to cremate when they can't afford the other, whether they plan for it or not. I think, you know, people need to, if nothing else, become a little bit familiar with it. So when the time comes, at least they have a little bit of knowledge so they're not going into it completely blind. And I
yeah,
didn't realize how important it was until I see it every day.
Yeah.
yeah.
When
Do
you
I
talk
was,
about it.
you
Go ahead,
know,
Yeah.
Stacy.
I had to do with, my dad, passed this year as we're, writing this book and the whole thing. So
Oh, I'm sorry.
I thanks. We had everything, Diane, like you said, everything was done, had, my parents, both have theirs done. We, the urns, the whole deal. So we're sitting in the funeral home, we're like, okay, it's all done. Then, they start trying to sell you on the other things. And I was like, okay, I know it's coming. I'm ready. Like, okay.
Yeah.
But, so they start rattling off, do you want your dad's remains turned into a diamond? I was like, oh no, no, I don't want that, but thank you. And then, what about like a paperweight? I was like, no. What about a blanket with his face? Oh, no, 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 certainly not that one. And then they get to, we can put cremains into space, and, the Space Coast is, 45 minutes from me. And I was like, well, hold on now. That sounds
Yeah.
intriguing. I was like, no, not that either.
Now,
But
there in Florida, you have the coral reef where they can put their
we
cremains
do.
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
Now, that's pretty cool,
Which
but
I do think is
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah,
that one.
actually,
And
our friend, our mutual friend and collaborator in Orlando,
uh-huh.
she's affiliated with. I always call it the Mermaid Company, but that's not what it's called. It's called
Yeah,
something
yeah.
else.
Yeah.
But yeah, so she actually can facilitate someone doing the whole like cremain coral reef thing.
Totally.
And I'm like Stacy, like I also want to be amongst things that are growing and so the tree is really, but I tell you what, I don't know if y'all are familiar with parting stones, but I that's kind of to me parting stones is pretty cool. Pretty cool. So I don't know. I've got a few things I'm interested in, but
We
um
did have two different occasions, Life Force Cemetery on the
yeah,
podcast.
mhm.
yep.
And I loved, one of my favorite things about that concept, uh, not just the story of how it all came to be with her mom, and she wanted something better for her mom, but um, the fact that they really do try and make it affordable for families.
Yeah.
Like it's the one fee will open up the space and they can put as many cremains in there as they need to, including pets. Like
Right.
they can do their pets, but and they don't charge for children, which I think is really, really important. We don't want to think that children die, but they do.
Mhm.
Either, again, this has been in the news a lot more lately with the school shootings, but also there's accidents. There's certain childhood
Illness.
diseases that
Mhm.
still get kids unexpectedly, so that
Yeah.
we still lose our children. To me, that's probably one of the most emotional type of burials that has to happen when you're a parent and you're going to have to bury a child, because you just, in the back of your head as a parent, it's a possibility. Like we all know it's a possibility, but we really don't want to think about that one. And the fact that Life Force offers a way for families to be able to give their children something a little bit more, even if they
A little
have,
bit more. Yeah.
if they have no money, they still have a way to memorialize their child, which, and to be in a forest, I think is perfect for a child.
Speaking of nature, actually Stacy wrote our chapter on greening death. So,
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
cool.
we include that as well because that's an important paradigm shift that's happening in but like anything that's breaking with tradition and more innovative accessibility is a problem. So I mean, aquamation might be um legal in your state, but you may not have access to it because
Right.
providers and facilities are slim to none on alkaline hydrolysis or water cremation, whatever you
Mhm.
want to call it. It's still very, yeah, inaccessible. So, but I think, alternative dispositions are gaining visibility, I think. Recompose. So you're in Colorado, so
Mhm.
you're familiar with um, body composting or,
Mhm.
Yep.
natural organic reduction, so I mean, I think these are really important for people whose, environment is important to them. And we touch on that. But again, accessibility, I mean, there's even within all our alternative options, there are still some disparities, especially once again, if funeral poverty is the core issue, then you even with your best intentions of wanting to do something environmentally friendly and green, you know and it's frustrating because you're like, it's my body, right? It's
Right.
my body, daggone it. If I want to be one with the soil, why can't I be one with the soil my way? So
And
go
these are
Frank Sinatra my way.
And these are very, as Jennifer's saying, they're very expensive propositions. And when I was researching municipal cemeteries, one person talked to me about, as a municipal cemetery manager, they are not necessarily allowed to be charging these exorbitant fees. In many cases, municipal cemeteries are the lower cost option. And
Right.
if you want a traditional burial, if you want your, cremains buried. So, she was telling me they were trying to look at what neighboring cemeteries were doing. Many of those were, privately owned cemeteries charging $10,000 in some
Mhm.
cases. And she
Yeah.
said to me, we can't do that. We're a municipal cemetery. And she said, we have to be concerned about OSHA. We have to be concerned about our worker safety. She
Hmm.
said, and she said, I don't have the equipment. So I'd have to purchase all new equipment. So she said, I want to be able to serve my community in New England that would
Right.
want something like this, but I can't just snap my fingers as your municipal cemetery manager and say, she's like, so we have to go through all of this due diligence. And she said, one of her quotes that kind of stuck out to me was like, I can't say to a family, we can't take a body because it's leaky. And it just still stuck out. And she said, but my workers have this interesting physical barrier of a coffin in many cases.
Right.
And now you remove that if it's, a natural burial and a shroud. So what do we do? So it's really interesting hearing, again, from what I study, a public servant talking about how this is now a government issue to solve in their town. And, Jenny, to go back to what you said before, this is a resource, like a resource trade-off. She's talking about how do I solve this problem when that's you know, could be doing something
Mhm.
Right.
totally different,
And
right?
I feel like in our current society, where there is a definitely a push now to have these alternative
Mhm.
options, mostly because, for so long it was in most cases, a traditional Christian burial or maybe a traditional Jewish burial. And we didn't expand beyond that, unless you were indigenous or something like that. Mostly we were doing these same burials for so long. But now in our modern society, we have so many different types of belief systems that a lot of people are straying away from wanting those traditional burials anymore. Not even just for the environmental impact of it, but also because it just doesn't align with what they believe in anymore. So they don't want that traditional service. So it is trying to, within the death care industry, especially the funeral homes and the cemeteries and stuff, how can they help to accommodate those new belief systems and still make it, like you said, whatever they need to do. And especially if it is a municipal cemetery where they are city run, they definitely, like you said, they definitely have a lot more rules and regulations they have to abide by versus the private cemeteries who can definitely do more with what they want, but they can also charge a lot more.
Charge a
So
lot more. Yep.
they can say, if this is what our population wants, sure, we'll do it, but you're going
Do
to
it.
pay for it. And you just know that you're going to pay big for it. Yeah.
It's interesting for me to dig a little bit into some of the literature, Jenny, that talked about that. So go back to something Jennifer said, like you're always learning when it's new. So
Right.
I got to play a little bit with sort of the language surrounding exactly what you said. So, you know, rest in peace is on so many, tombstones, right? This idea that your body can just be at rest, right? So I got to dig in a little bit to the literature of, well, what does it mean when your body becomes wrapped in these narratives of even in death, you have to be doing something. And what happens if you feel bad that you can't afford that, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you can't afford to be turned into compost that does something, a tree like me that does something, that adds to something, are you going to be potentially shamed for saying, I would still like that traditional in casket burial and want to be buried in the ground, the end? So it
Right.
was really interesting to see how some of this consumerism language and pushes against, blatant consumerism,
Mm.
which for so long, sometimes cremation was, marketed as the cleaner alternative, the cheaper alternative, the greener one, put your, favorite descriptor there.
Right.
And why would you want to be in the ground? Why would you want to be peaceful in any way? And so you put that in the narratives of just anti-consumerism. It was just a really interesting sort of body of literature and knowledge to dig into of, am I doing something that is not a in-ground casket burial because I want to, or because
Mhm.
I'm feeling compelled to keep showing, some signal even in death. So it's just, and then what happens if I can't even access that? Do I still get
Right.
a quote unquote good death? It was just really interesting to think of it in that regard.
And I think
That's why
that's just
education is so important.
Hmm.
mhm. It's definitely a broader part of what we need to learn about for death. Like
Hmm.
it's just, again, it's important that we are willing to talk about it, even if you just talk about it with your spouse or your best friend or your parents, like having some sort of conversation around the things that you want. And maybe, and I know not everybody can save for death like we would like them to be able to, because there's so many people that, you live paycheck to paycheck. So
Living
just,
is expensive.
yeah, just live, putting a roof over your head, paying for your utilities and putting food on the table takes all the finances you currently have. And so for some people, that the reality is they will never be able to save for death. But it would be nice if communities could come together with some ways to make it for those that can't, at least give them, again, some dignity and some sort of memorialization, so that they don't just disappear. Like, I mean, some people may want that, but I think most humans have that innate moment if they want to be remembered at least a little bit in part,
Mhm.
And so to not have anything available to some people other than this anonymous disappearance of your remains once you're done, like I think that needs to become a broader part of our conversation as a whole in the world. And not even just we have listeners in other countries, and I know they have these issues too, and they have some issues that we haven't even really considered yet here, because they have way more burial grounds and cemeteries and they're out of space entirely. So
Mhm.
they're fighting that in other countries, where we fortunately aren't necessarily at that point, but I know in some spaces in our country we are getting there. Depends on the size of your state and your population and all of that. But
Well, and like I said
Yeah,
before,
to
just the
render.
education. I mean, you take the time to go pick your kids' daycare. You go pick the time to pick your kids' college and maybe even your puppy daycare. But how often do you visit the local cemeteries, to look at the option, actually go in and talk to them and see what options are available? Maybe there are ways to do green burials without huge expense. There's just different things they can put in place or not have in place to allow for that green burial. And just people don't know until they don't. People don't know what's available until they ask.
yeah,
Yeah.
and better to do it before it becomes that
Mhm.
hugely emotional decision where, again, they can play on those emotions for the ones that really want to, and try and upcharge for things that you may or may not need later. And you don't, I mean, because we all grieve differently, you don't know how you would respond to that in that moment. Like you
Exactly.
yourself with your dad, you kind of knew, no, we
Hmm.
don't need these things, we're good. But like somebody else, especially if it was a really sudden death or unexpected,
Mhm.
they, in that moment, they may not be able to separate that, thing and be like, yes, I want that diamond, or whatever it is. um and so at least having something in place in your mind, and having, like Diane said, you can just go in and talk to him. You don't have to
Yeah.
sign up for anything right
Right.
then, but at least you have some literature in your hand and you have something that helps you um, put the thought there. And over time, maybe it becomes something bigger for you or for your loved ones, or, if you're like our age, 40s and 50s and stuff, and you've got aging parents who maybe sometimes haven't told you what their plans are, now's the time to start talking to them, while they can still talk to you and they can tell you what they want, so that you can hopefully make that happen for them, and you can sit down and look at them, look at their finances. And I think we talked about this with Amy. We said it too. There's a portion of especially our older population, our boomer and above population, if we want to use that term, where a lot of the women don't know their financial situation
Right.
necessarily because their husbands have handled it forever. And so when it comes to, and if the husband dies first, they're in this mode of now they're planning a funeral. Now they're grieving their husband. Now they have to take over their finances and they've never paid a bill in their life because their husband always did it. And we still have those people in society. And I think we forget about them too. And this having something ahead of time. So if you're the child, again, sitting down with them and saying, okay, mom and dad, we need to know, I need to know this for you so that I can help guide you through this later, depending on who goes first or, whatever it is. Um, and again, those are people we don't always think about unless you have actual contact with them or you're in, an industry where you would work with those particular women in this case. I mean, I've read about it so many times, and working in the medical industry, and actually working with elderly patients, I've come across it a lot, where we will have patients come in who've lost their husbands, and they are just so overwhelmed because they didn't know that they were going to have to handle all of this, and they didn't know how to handle all of it. And some of them are fortunate to have children who can walk them through it, but there are some that don't. So, and they don't have another family member nearby that's going to help educate them and keep them going and show them the ropes, which is really sad and scary to me.
Yeah.
To have that. I think now women were definitely more educated. We all came back and said, no, we're going to learn how to do our own money and do our own finances, and that's fine. So we know about it more, but there's still a whole part of our population that doesn't know that too. So then it just adds another layer to this part of the equity and death and stuff, or at least I think.
Yeah, it's huge.
About policy, because we talk a lot about policy in the book and how policy affects people's planning. One thing that a lot of folks don't know is that if you don't die in the state where your plans are, you could have some complications there. And so part of death literacy is truly knowing kind of, what you need to do if you move, right? So if you've
Mhm.
got all your care, your death care plan set,
Mm-hmm.
everything set, but then you move. I even have interviewed people where they have a loved one that was on vacation and died
Oof.
and had to transport the body and all the hoops and all that kind of stuff. And you don't have to know all the stuff, but
Right.
but building resources, knowing who you can talk to and how to access that information, especially if you need it quickly. So I think that's why our community death care providers, your funeral homes that are, at least in my town, about every other block, we've got one.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
yeah, yeah, we have a lot here for the size of town I live in. I think that there could be a little bit of nudging and pressure put on our death care providers to really be more transparent and helping their community understand those nuances and that decision-making process. Because honestly, even though you don't have to pay in full at pre-arrangement, you can go in, you can kind of file your plan and that sort of thing. At some point, you're going to have to put some dollars down.
Right.
And then it is a sales situation. And so anytime you're in a sales situation, you are at risk for some, upselling and some tactics and things like that. So I think that that's another thing death doulas are really good at is educating people on choices because they don't have money on the table when it comes to, body disposition. They may help with memorializing. There are some unfortunate court cases right now where funeral homes, funeral homeowners in Illinois and California, I think, are no, actually here in my home state, Indiana, and California, where some death doulas are unfortunately in the hot seat because funeral directors do not like any part of their potential service line to be subsumed by a death doula, which I think is a bunch of malarkey. Um, those are very distinct and separate professions. But
Oh
anyway,
yeah.
just for people to know that it does matter where you die.
Yeah.
And that there are some nuances to all of that, that when we educate ourselves, we can be better prepared.
And this might be a question for Staci, because you do a lot of the policy and stuff. Aside from our funeral homes and things like that, where are some other points in our communities where we can have that sort of information outreach so that people are not completely caught off guard? Like, where else do we go for that besides the funeral home? Or where could we go that we could start to work on improving with our communities?
I mean, goodness, and Jennifer, you can help me out here. I mean, I think it depends on, this is going to be deeply unsatisfying, probably, Jenny. It depends, I think, what you're looking for, because I think we focused so much on the consumer aspect because that's what we get at the federal level, right?
Right.
The protection we get is, the funeral rule and consumer protection. So we don't really get a lot of policies that trickle down into who regulates if a body is sent to a hospital for a donation to science. We don't really get a lot of what should forensic pathologists be being trained, in, and why is there a shortage of them? There's a
Right.
huge shortage throughout the country of forensic pathologists that for over a decade the federal government's trying to, sort of work on and trickle down, but it's a profession that is largely underpaid, undervalued compared to, other medical professions that get a lot more
Right.
money. So you have equity issues that spring up. Jennifer just said it matters where you die, and it also matters where you die when if you get, access to autopsy, for example. ProPublica has been doing some great reporting on the Idaho coroner system and all of the sort of breakdowns there. So I think, I would say take a couple minutes and see what your state statutes say about, I just, if you have access to the internet, state statutes cremation, state statutes burial. We have some questions in our book of like, do I do I need to be embalmed? Most cases, right, Jennifer? No. Do I
Yeah.
need,
Well, there's new
some,
states that require embalming,
some,
but
some,
there
so
are
just
rules
no.
around body
Yeah.
cooling. So, if you can't if you can't get everybody to come from all corners of the country in time, and your
Yeah.
funeral home does not have access to, being able to cool the body long enough, then it limits, certainly it limits your options. Every state has a time limit that a body can remain, you know, um, uncooled, or, whether it's dry ice or a cooler or refrigeration or whatever. So,
Right.
I mean, but people don't know that. So to speak to what you were, talking about, Staci, is just that, people, if they don't think to look up, these statutes or what they're allowed to do in their own state, um, then they might be unprepared for, hey, you've got 72 hours, you've got
Right.
48 hours, you've got 24 hours.
Right.
They don't know how the paperwork works. They don't know, who signs this? Who signs the death certificate? Who does
Where do
this?
I get one?
Where do I get one?
Right.
And, so they're Googling, right? Death certificate, state of Florida or Indiana or Colorado or whatever. But yeah, and you don't want to do that when you're grieving.
No.
You don't want to do any of that. So, I mean, and funeral directors and death doulas can certainly be immensely helpful when some of those questions pop up. But not even everybody has that, going on at the time of death, depending. So it can be really complicated and quite awful. So.
And Jennifer, you mentioned you're part of a death cafe. If someone has access to a death cafe in their local community, that could be another great resource because they're not a grief group. It's an
Right.
information.
No, right, right.
Mhm.
Yeah, it is definitely not it's not a
A
support group.
support group.
It
Yeah.
is, although there's a lot of storytelling that happens in
Sure.
death
Right.
cafes, which is really nice. But
Yeah.
and every I've been to a few. They're all different depending on the leader. But yeah, I think there's a lot of great resources, and I think people like me. So I'm a social worker by trade. I mean, I'm a professor of social work and a researcher, but I'm a social worker by trade, and I think we are kind of the advocates for the disenfranchised and the marginalized.
Yeah.
And so I think one of our central roles and one of the projects I'm working on now is more death education in our profession in social work. So the VA, for example, is the largest hirer of social workers in the country. So there are thousands of social workers that work in the VA system, and you have veterans that don't even know about their own veteran death benefit.
Right.
The VA has an entire, that's all that, they
Right.
have an entire section of the VA that's all they do, right? And some people don't know their benefits. So being able to plant people in spaces, whether it's hospitals and morgues and mortuaries and cemeteries and funeral homes. China actually has a social work funeral home model where people don't have to advocate for themselves when they're grieving. They have someone who will advocate on their behalf with them, find out what they actually want, because then sales aren't, so
Right.
it's a really interesting model to consider. And my Equal Death Care co-founder, Kat Vansel Coleman, is a funeral director. So when you have a social worker and a funeral director kind of coming together to build this sort of resource knowledge base, we talk about things like that. It's like we need to be very transparent that people are being scammed, and that does sometimes look bad for the funeral profession. But yeah, I think, again, it's that community education piece, and we got to figure out better ways to do that. I'm not sure if we wait for funeral directors to do it, that it'll happen. And
And that's what I'm
Yeah.
thinking.
busy.
There should be other places within the community where people
Yes.
aren't frequenting anyway. And so we can make the information available to them. And we have to, and again, especially in the United States, every state is different. They all have different rules when it comes to how burial and death and everything is handled. And so there's not like one, and we've had many discussions about this. There's not one central place that we can log on to and be like, here's all the
Right.
rules for what
The
happens when
Walmart
someone dies.
of dying. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, it would make life easier if there was,
So
but
much.
that's not how we operate. So you really do have to learn it. And so I feel like, you know, maybe this is where we open up discussions, opportunities at your local library. I mean, libraries are great resources for things.
Bingo.
And
Absolutely.
they can host talks and community events where people could come in and learn
Mhm.
as a community these things. Obviously hospitals would be another place, but again, I have that moment of, if you're hospitalized because you're going to be dying and you're really ill, and even talking to your family at that point, again, there's that emotional overwhelm because you're in the hospital and
Absolutely.
you're not comfortable because you're in the hospital and you've got
Mhm.
9,000 things going on that people are telling you and telling your family. And so while it should probably be part of that, it's probably not the
Mhm.
best place to start.
No,
Yeah.
No offense to
actually,
hospitals.
it may be because I've had many people call and they were, calling to ask, like grandpa's in hospice, he has a few days left, or my dad's in
Oh,
hospice,
too.
few days left. He goes, what is the first thing I do? What is the first thing I should do? And I said, well, you find a funeral home because once the person dies, they will, and I wasn't 100% sure how they do it. I don't know if they take turns doing the pickup or what, but if you don't like the first funeral home, then you're going to have the body moved to the second one. So at
Mhm.
least have the funeral home picked out. So when the person does pass, you know where they're going.
Yeah.
You're not having to figure that out then, or just hope that wherever they're going is going to be a good, safe, reputable funeral home for your family.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we called it Death Day at UCF downtown here. It was myself, a couple colleagues from different disciplines. We opened it up to the community. We had a death doula come who just saw it, like happened to see it online and was like, I just want to come. And we had a bunch of undergrads from different disciplines. One brought her father because she thought it sounded interesting. So, not necessarily a library or a hospital, but it was just really nice to have just folks sit in a room to say, what are you guys talking about? How are you studying this? And just trying to form, kind of like Jennifer and I did, say, hey, there's not a lot of people even studying this. Can we just know each other? Can we have those
Yeah.
conversations, take them out of, like you guys have been grateful enough to give us the space to take, what we do outside of the, our little academic bubbles and say, hey, you know, these are important things. And if, even one of your listeners talks to their doctor, like
Mhm.
that's
Oh,
awesome.
yeah.
Or starts a
Exactly.
conversation in the library, or starts it in a cemetery. I don't care. That would be
Yeah.
awesome. Send us a picture. That
There
would
you
be
go.
that would be great, because that was our hope in writing this. If we can just have even one person somewhere take some of the questions, we put in the book and say, hey, I read this, you know, what can I do?
And create some resources so that
Yeah.
people have, and create it so that it's known enough that people know they can go there and get whatever information they're seeking when it comes to death and dying at this point. And hopefully, I mean, I don't think as humans we'll ever be truly 101% comfortable with dying, because it means the end of that life cycle that you knew, and all of those things. But hopefully it will just ease some anxiety about some of it, because that's probably one of the hardest things we deal with as humans every
Mhm.
time, and we all will deal with it at some point, either for ourselves, but also people we know. Like, even if we don't lose anybody tragically or suddenly, at some point you're going to lose people you love. So it's good to know these things ahead of time. Well, ladies, thank
Yeah,
you
this was
so
wonderful.
much for
Thank
joining
you.
us and talking about it. The book is not available yet, but we will keep track of it. And so when it does become available, we can let our listeners know, and you guys will have the opportunity to read it for yourself and learn all the things that both Staci and Jennifer have taken years to study. So it's not like this was an overnight, let's
Right.
sit down and write a book. This has been years in the making. And so we will look forward to helping promote that once the book becomes available. So you can keep us posted on that.
We will. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more about today's episode, visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you'll find additional links in our show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Your support helps others find our show and discover all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories.
You can also follow us on social media for cemetery facts, photos, quotes, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery. If you'd like to help support us financially, you can donate a cup of coffee by clicking on the coffee cup icon on our website or YouTube, or purchase some of our fabulous Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery merchandise through our store link.
Until we meet again.